joined together are sort of history of Orientalism, of the problem of Orientalism, sort of personal accounts and analysis. And the last two lectures in April and May will be a way out of Orientalism, at least as I see it, an alternative to Orientalism, which I have dubbed internationalism, but there are of course other words for it, and I will say a few words about it at the end of today's talk. Last week I showed you this picture several times, one of the bridges across the Bosphorus in Istanbul. A vision, of course, not only of a great metropolis, but also of two continents, of East and West, that meet in one city and that are joined here by the water of the Bosphorus. And the question, of course, is this the sea that divides or the sea that unites? And I read for you last week a beautiful poem at the end of my talk by Hendrik Marsman, a Dutch poet, who wrote in 1939 a poem called The Sea, in which he develops his vision of the Mediterranean Sea as a unifying force between various cultures, that of classical antiquity and its aftermath, that of Islam and that of Christianity, of the Jewish Christian tradition, that in his view belong to the same cultural region, to the same cultural world, and that in their coming together in this region provide a new spirit, a new inspiration. And of course the timing was not only perfect, 1939, but it was also not coincidental that he wrote about this internationalism, this perspective, this intercultural perspective in this year. He was very much politically active in Holland. He was very much a voice that spoke out against the nationalism of the 30s, not only in Germany, but also, of course, in Holland and in the UK and in France. And that poem, his last one before he died, was the expression of this new vision. And as I told you, I would like to see that poem as a programmatic statement for my lectures. So this wonderful city, with its very attractive city landscape, with its beautiful Hagia Sophia symbolically in the middle, symbolically also because it used to be the great church, the great Christian church of the Byzantine Empire, and then it became the great mosque of the Ottoman Empire. Is there any symbol as strong as that? And as I said last time, I like to say that Istanbul is the only remaining real metropolis of Europe. Think of that. I really think of Istanbul not only as an Asian city, but also as a European city. And in its diversity and in its intellectual standing, in its history, in its scope in human culture, of course it compares well to the ancient and medieval and early modern cities of the East and also of the West. And if we talk about cities, of course we go back to the city of Uruk that I introduced to you last time, the city where script was invented in the 4th millennium BC, and an immense discovery. And this city, this one of the earliest cities, has become ingrained in our mental DNA as an image also with a temple tower, depicted famously by Pieter Bruegel, as I showed to you, and also by Anselm Kiefer. This idea of a city, of a culture centered on one place, of a loyalty to a place, and of a symbolic presence in the landscape, expressed by one of those temple towers or by Hagia Sophia, is a very powerful and ancient image, and I will come back to that today. Now these images, here is Bruegel, and also perhaps the inspiration for that, the city of Eridu that I introduced to you, founded in the 6th millennium BC. Can you even imagine how old that is? One of the oldest cities that has ever been discovered. I introduced these to say not only that these things are so old, but also that these traditions are so continuous. Some of these stories are so old and so widespread that we don't even notice them anymore. They are so much part of our consciousness that we take them for granted as something that is natural, but they are not natural. They are cultural constructs, and we carry them along. And remember that I introduced to you also the picture of a horse last time, and I introduced it to you as a cultural product. Think of these stories, of these images, as the same cultural products that unite us with Mesopotamia, with the city of Eridu. It goes all the way back, like language, which was spread at Babylon, according to the Old Testament. The book of Genesis famously explains that at Babylon, God destroyed the unity of language. He spread people in all directions, and he made their tongues confused to avoid that they would reach heaven by this building. He was jealous. The God of Genesis is a jealous God, and he expresses his fear in this passage of Genesis that man will reach heaven, and he has to do something against it. Those are a few images that I wanted to reintroduce because I will continue with them. And a last image that I introduced to you and that I also want to reintroduce is this really beautiful painting by Anselm Kiefer, a contemporary German painter, although he works in France most of the time, who retakes the famous painting by Pieter Bruegel, and he changes it a little bit, although he is also an homage. You can see that in the colors, for instance, so the blue of the sky, the ochre of the building, he uses the same tones in his color, but he removes the people from the image. So it becomes a timeless image, it becomes an icon. And it is not only a memory, and it is not only a ruin of what could have been or once was, but it is also a possibility. It is an archetype. The building is damaged, but it is still there. It's still there in material sense, but in spiritual sense even more, because it represents man's desire to reach above his own level, to be more than just a number, to be divine in his aspirations. This is what Kiefer, I'm pretty sure, sees in this image. And this is, for me, very interesting because he uses this really wonderful image that comes from the Orient as an inspiration in his work. Kiefer uses all kinds of sources for his inspiration, and he doesn't distinguish between European and Near Eastern sources. For him, it's one big reservoir of ideas, of images, of dreams, of lost hopes that he can use in his work. A great example for what we're doing here. Now these cities, and now I continue, like Constantinople, Istanbul, but also like for instance Alexandria in Egypt or Beirut in Lebanon, they have been described even recently by Philip Mansell as the great heirs to the ancient cities of the ancient East, in the sense that they are not only ancient and that they have very deep cultural traditions, but also in the sense that they are multicultural and multi-ethnic. And I think that the perspective that Philip Mansell, who is a great author, is a bit gloomy in that he lets this end in the case of Istanbul in 1924, and that in his book about his most recent book about the Levant, he also talks about a disappearing world. I think that's a bit gloomy, and I also think that, especially in the case of Istanbul, there's a whole new dynamic. There are all kinds of new groups coming into Istanbul, and I don't believe that Istanbul will easily lose its multi-ethnic, multicultural character. But the essence of these books is exactly that fact, that these cities have always been powerful entities between the individual and the state, and their nature was made multicultural, multi-ethnic, open to the world. And this is a perspective which he shows very clearly in these books, that is very important for us as an inspiration in European Mediterranean history, but also as an example in our own world. They functioned really well, these cities, despite all kinds of troubles that obviously they had. But as a model, they remain very interesting. This is the kind of dialogue that I would imagine, the kind of interest that I would imagine would be fruitful, also within, of course, an association like Oriental Heritage Without Borders. So, having said so, what is wrong then with the study of everything Oriental, everything Near Eastern? Why are we still talking about Orientalism? Is there such a thing as Orientalism? According to Eduard Said, whom I introduced last time, obviously there is Orientalism, otherwise he wouldn't have written a book about it. But there are people, many of his critics actually, think that there is not really such a thing as Orientalism. And that what he is doing in this book is actually an overstatement of the case. That in reality, the West was not as bad in its reaction to the East. And there have been all kinds of accusations against him. Some are correct, or at least understandable. Some are just plainly incorrect. And a third group is just mean. And I mean, there have been really personal attacks on him, on his character. One of the accusations that has been made is that he hates the West. And interestingly, this accusation has been made in two ways. It has been made by defenders of the West, but it has also been made by people in the Near East, in the Near and the Middle East, that identified with him and saw him as a champion, you know, for their political movement. Which in both perspectives, I think, are quite incorrect. He doesn't try to identify himself as anti-Western or as pro-Oriental. In fact, what I think is the main problem with the book is that he doesn't talk about the Near East at all, or hardly. He doesn't go into the reality of the Orient. And he says so. He admits this in his own preface. He says, this book is not about the real Orient. I think Orientalism has little to do with the real Orient. I talk about a phenomenon, about an image, a phantom, about a cultural construct, and I will not go into the real Orient. And I understand that position, but I still think it was a mistake in this book, because by doing so, he imprisons himself in the same duality that Orientalism has created. And of course he fights it, but he remains in the same dialectical prison that others have created. And I will try to give some examples of that. So let's go again to the definition that he gives of Orientalism, which I think is useful for the things that I will say after this. So he defines it as a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in Western experience. The Orient is not only adjacent to Europe, it is also the place of Europe's greatest and richest and oldest colonies, the source of its civilizations and languages, its cultural contestant, and the one of its deepest and most recurring images of the other. That is, of course, very important. In addition, the Orient had helped to define Europe, or the West, as its contrasting image, idea, personality, experience. So the Orient, yes, thank you. The Orient really is not so much a cultural datum, not something that you can really grasp, but it has been developed by the West as the image of the other. And you need an image of the other to define yourself. It is a mirror image. You need a mirror to see yourself. You need a negative definition to make a good definition of yourself. And this is how Orientalism works. And Said is fair enough to admit that, of course, not only Europeans or Westerners have done this in history. This is in fact a very normal cultural thing to do. Only because of the enormous political waves of European civilization in the last 500 years, Orientalism has become something so massive and so dominant that by now it's hard to discover its background as a cultural construct. And many of the ideas and the visions developed within Orientalism have become accepted truths. And many of the things that you can do within Orientalism seem normal to us. For instance, the generalizations. Nobody nowadays will talk about the typical mind of black people. I mean, we all know we shouldn't do that, not generalize like that. But there are still books about the Arab mind. You can still do that. And this is, Said tells us, because there is such a thing as Orientalism. I actually think that a little bit of light would be nice.
We'll turn this.
Otherwise I cannot read my notes.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
But it's also going to be unreadable.
Yeah, because as spontaneous as this may seem, there is actually a script. Yeah. A contrasting idea of Europe, a very powerful idea that enables us to make generalizations about another culture, a series of cultures, obviously. Therefore, he continues, as much as the West itself, interesting point, the Orient is an idea that has a history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and vocabulary that have given it reality and presence in and for the West. The two geographical entities thus support and to an extent reflect each other. And I find this a very interesting definition because, first of all, Europe itself is, of course, also a construct. There is no such thing as the continent Europe. This is just an idea. There is no clear border of Europe. This is also why there's an eternal discussion about how big the European Union should be, because there are no natural borders. Africa is well defined. America is well defined. Australia is well defined. But Europe is not well defined. Europe and the Orient have hazy borders. They exist in our minds, but not on the map. So that's one thing. The other thing is this sentence, that have given it reality. This is, I think, very important for understanding Said. He really believes, as an intellectual and as an historian of the history of ideas, that constructs, cultural constructs, ideas, can gain a reality. They start as a fear or as a hope or an imagination about the other, but because of the accumulation of ideas, grouping of ideas around this original idea, the development of this vision or fear or whatever, and because of the history and because of the things that have been done in the name of this idea, it gains reality. It becomes a real thing. This is very important for Said and also very dangerous, because I think in the end he really believes in an Orient and in a Europe as distinct cultural entities. And one of the problems with his approach, as I said before, is that he doesn't really engage in this book with a real Orient or with a real Europe, and especially not in the history of this conflict, of this distinction between West and East. Had he done so more thoroughly, I think he could have deconstructed this division more easily, and I think it would have been fruitful for his book. But we will come back to that. Now, he does have an escape, but like any book that is critical about society or an idea or a political movement, the book covers mainly the critical part, and the solution is very brief. He doesn't really go into the utopia beyond Orientalism. He has just some ideas. To be fair, he has done a little bit more about that in other books, but this, I think, should also have been done here and more systematically. So what does he do? And that is something that I find very sympathetic. That is to refer to Goethe. Goethe has developed the idea of Weltliteratur, world literature, a concept that we still use. This comes from Goethe, and it was originally designed as a way to appreciate culture, not just literature, as a kind of symphony, a world symphony, within which the individual part will remain individual parts. They will speak for themselves, but they will be appreciated within a larger unity. That will mean that in your aesthetic perception of a poem of Hafiz, for instance, that Goethe was fond of Persian poetry, you will appreciate that from your point of view, from your culture. You will try to understand it as it is from the culture from which it comes, and you will see it in a larger context of world culture. Which is, of course, a very difficult thing to do. I mean, you really need an engaging humanist intellectual to be able, that is able to do this, to step over these perceived borders between cultures, because it's not so easy, as said, to enter a different culture and to understand it, but as an idea, as a hopeful direction, of course, it has great value. So this is what he talks about. So I will take that lead, and especially in the sessions in April and May, I will try to develop this idea a little bit further. For today, I first go back a little bit, and I will discuss some of the examples that Said gives of Orientalism, and some other examples as well. Like last week, I will try to show you how difficult this concept actually is. On the one hand, how clear it is. On the other hand, how not so clear it is at all. So here we have, for instance, a passage from the works of Chateaubriand, famous French historian, politician, political writer, traveler, who has left an immense and largely very boring oeuvre, including many travel diaries, including a diary, a book about his travel to the Levant. And he talks about the Crusades in this context. So he actually has been in Palestine, and talking about his travel there, he says the following: the Crusades were not only about the deliverance of the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb where Christ was buried, but more about knowing which would win on the earth. So he doesn't use little words, this guy. A cult that was civilization's enemy, of course Islam, systematically favorable to ignorance, to despotism, to slavery, or a cult that had caused to reawaken in modern people the genius of a sage antiquity and had abolished base servitude. And he dares to say this in an age where slave trade by European nations was still very active, but he forgets that for the time being. Nor does he really reflect on the incredible number of people killed in the Crusades just to liberate people from their despotism. This is a very interesting idea. Think about this. The West has to rescue the East from slavery. We have to teach the East liberty. Think of this. Think of this because it's so actual. This is an idea that recurs again and again. And it is when I read it in the newspaper, that we are going to teach people in Iraq about democracy or civil rights, I'm always stunned that people can say this without realizing that they are stepping into this Orientalist tradition that is generalizing, that makes of the Orient a sort of amorphous whole that is not speaking, that does have no voice of itself, that has no tradition of political thought or whatever, and we have to rescue this poor Orient. This actually, people saying this thing that they're doing something good, they also in their rhetoric, they don't realize that they are just reusing cliches that are as old as Chateaubriand and even more old. And you can already read in for instance, ancient Greek speeches from Athens, this view that only they know about liberty, about the real individual civil life in the Greek city-state, and nobody else knows about this. And we have this mission to teach humanity or whatever, how they should feel free. So this is a very old idea. So it is really breathtaking to see that repeated all the time. Another cliché. This is a passage from Ernest Renan, who remains in the history of scholarship one of the great gods of linguistics. He was one of the first to write about comparative Semitic linguistics, and his work has for a long time remained the standard in this regard. He was really the first to compare all the Semitic languages together in a systematic way. So you would think that he would have a kind of sympathy for his subject. He devoted his life to that, but that's not true. That's not true. He's when it comes down to it, he's very negative about the Semitic languages. So this is around the middle of the 19th century, and read what he says. We refuse to allow that the Semitic languages have the capacity to regenerate themselves, even while recognizing that they do not escape any more than other products of human consciousness the necessity of change or of successive modifications. So it sounds maybe innocent to you, but what he really means is that there is a difference between Semitic languages and Indo-European languages. Indo-European languages are creative, they are intellectual, they change according to the necessities of the development within those cultures, and the Semitic languages are fossilized. They have remained in one state, and this you have to read obviously as a state in which the Semitic world was in a better state, and a period where the Semitic world was in a better state, and the languages reflect the fossilization of the Near East. It has become silent, it doesn't develop anymore, and its languages do not rejuvenate anymore. They are not real languages like in the European languages. And this language thing is very important. It developed in the 19th century, that people started to notice that languages can be grouped in families. The Grimm brothers, for instance, were very influential in this regard. And the original linguists who thought about these theories, they really thought about languages only. They were thinking about abstract categories in the European, Semitic, Caucasian, for instance. But pretty soon this developed into a connection between language and culture, and from language and culture to ethnicity and to race in the end. So to speak an Indo-European language also means something cultural, and in the end it can mean something racial. And to speak a Semitic language also means something cultural and something racial in the end. And then by the end you can categorize the whole world in a very easy system, which is, of course, is also a system from which you can never escape. You can never escape from it. If you are in the Semitic world, and if you are in this fossilized system, you will never escape from it. That is because it's in the nature, almost in your genes, not to be able to rejuvenate. So there is something really, for us at least, very nasty in this what Renan is. But I don't pretend that Renan was like the leader, of an anti-Semitic movement or whatever. This was quite normal in his age, absolutely quite normal. And also to study Semitic languages, or for instance Islam or Arabic culture or whatever in the 19th century, and devote your life to it, and at the same time be hypercritical about it and almost hate it, was something very normal. It's very normal. It occurs all the time. So just to give a few examples, here is another one. This is a book called Modern Egypt, written by the Earl of Cromer. That is the aristocratic title of Evelyn Baring, who was the governor, the consul general, I should say, of Egypt by the late 19th century, when, as you know, Great Britain occupied Egypt. And he talks about the land that he governed for, 15 years. He was 15 years, he was the governor of Egypt. So you should think that he has a good impression of this country. And he thought too, that's why he wrote a book about it, obviously. So this is a famous passage from that book. Sir Alfred Lyell once said to me, accuracy is abhorrent to the Oriental minds. Every Anglo-Indian should always remember that maxim. Want of accuracy, which easily degenerates into untruthfulness, is in fact the main characteristic of the Oriental mind. The European is a close reasoner. His statements of fact are devoid of any ambiguity. I wonder whether this guy ever had been in the suburbs of London or Manchester.